as well. Evie is a local descendant of survivors here in town, and I'm very privileged to know her as a volunteer docent here at the museum. So they've both agreed to speak with me a little bit about some of the meaning that this wonderful film offers. So I think we'll dive right into it. Paula, my first question is for you, and I'd like to, I'm wondering if you might share with everyone a little bit, sort of how you came to make this film. My understanding is your background professionally isn't necessarily in Holocaust or Jewish film in particular. So how did you kind of come into making this?
So is this on now? Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm actually a science producer, and I led the PBS Nova series for 33 years and made many science films myself, also in history films. And at Nova in 2016, I made a film in Lithuania with my co-director, Kirk Wolfinger, called Holocaust Escape Tunnel, in which we were with a group of geoarchaeologists led by Professor Richard Freund, to whom this film is dedicated, who sadly passed away before it was completely finished, although he did fortunately see the fine cut a few days before he died. And there had long been rumored to be a tunnel that there were 80 Jewish prisoners who were forced into the Ponary extermination site in near Vilna, Lithuania, and they were brought in to burn and exhume the bodies because the Germans knew that they were losing the war and they wanted to eliminate all the evidence. And they knew, these 80 Jews knew they would be the last victims when they were done with their grisly, horrible work. And so at night, they dug a tunnel and used it to escape, and 12 of them actually succeeded. But this had been just rumored to exist. Nobody knew if it really existed. And so we made a film about this, and in an amazing feat of using high-tech electronic equipment, this group under Professor Freund actually confirmed that the tunnel existed. So I was actually there. I always used to say, as executive producer of Nova, I always used to talk about the moment of discovery, but I never was there. I never was there when anybody discovered anything except this in 2016. The film was very successful on Nova, but after I retired in 2019, I started to think, why didn't I ever know about this tunnel? Why didn't I ever know about any incidents of Jewish resistance except for the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? And I started to do some research, and with the encouragement of Professor Freund, in which Richard Freund encouraged you to do something, you wound up doing it one way or another, whether you actually wanted to or not. And my husband Sheldon, who's here today, and I started doing research, and I realized this was really a great story. It was an amazing story that very few people knew about, so I wound up making this film.
Terrific. Evie, my next question is for you. I'm wondering if you might tell us a little bit about your parents and sort of there's a broad kind of overview of their connection to resistance movements during the Holocaust, and where kind of do you see their story, their experience fitting in or not fitting in with regard to what we've just seen?
I brought an old-fashioned PowerPoint so I can do a little show and tell. So, my parents were both Polish Jews who survived in Poland and the Ukraine. And when I watched this film, and I had seen it once before, I'm just so, amazed at just what everybody went through and how my parents managed. You know, in Poland, 90% of the Jewish population died. So my parents were in the 10%. My mother was born in Krakow, and she was in a family with 5 children. I am showing you this picture because, in fact, the museum has an exhibit, which some of you who have not been here before may not know. The exhibit over here on both sides of the rafters is called Suspended Lineage, and those are pictures of people connected to Tucsonans who perished in the Holocaust. And so this photograph, and I don't know if you can see my PowerPoint here, this photograph is up in the rafters, and it shows my mother with her 2 sisters and her 2 brothers and my grandparents. My mother's family was prosperous. They lived in Krakow, as I said. My grandfather owned a restaurant and 3 houses, I heard, and had tenants living in 2 of them. My mother died when I was 9 years old of cancer. She survived the Holocaust, but not cancer. And my dad died when I was 22 of his second heart attack. So I have information, a lot of information from different sources, documents that I have, photographs that my mother left in an album and brought from Poland to England to New York. And my uncle, my father's youngest brother, wrote a memoir. So some of that information I have. Can I do a couple more minutes? Yeah, okay. Oh, okay. So my parents met in Krakow, and I didn't tell you yet about my father's family. I'll start with that and then go back to my parents. My father was from Jasło, and Joel Alpert in the audience here will understand why I'm showing you this book of Jasło. This was the first in a series of Yiskor books that was published by Jewish Gen. So a lot of information that I got about my father's town was there in the book. That's okay. And my father's family was an observant Jewish family. My grandfather, no, not yet. I'll let you know. Okay. So my grandfather in Jasło owned a soap and detergent factory, and he had a Gentile partner, which apparently was not very usual. Jasło was a town of 35,000, and of those, there were 3,500 Jews. So it was not like Krakow, where about a third of the population was Jewish. And my grandparents had my father go to public primary and secondary schools rather than going to the yeshiva or, the Jewish schools that would produce Talmudic scholars. And my father did well. He studied German and Latin and spoke very good German, which comes up in the film about Jews who could speak German. And he, at 18 years old, he went off to Prague to medical school. He didn't go to the closest medical school in Krakow because of the numerus clausus, which was the quotas that prohibited a lot of Jews to go to the university. So my father graduated medical school. He was born in 1909, so by the time he graduated medical school, he was in his 20s already, and he got a job in Krakow at a Jewish hospital. So it was in Krakow that he met my mother. I would like to add something I didn't say before, which was that my mother was well educated. She went to a private girls' gymnasium, and she learned also French and German and Latin and did 1 year at the university. So they got married in June of 1939 in Krakow, 3 months before the Nazis invaded September 1st, 1939. So there's a lot more to the story. I didn't get to how they were connected to the resistance movement, but I would say right now that my mother's family was prepared. They were educated, they read newspapers, they knew what was going on, and they had means. So on September 2nd, they had 2 cars, one that they owned and one that they rented, and they went off east, joining thousands of Jews who left their homes to go east. And then at the same time, my father's brother and my grandfather from Yaswo, they also went east, and they left my grandmother in Yaswo because, like the film pointed out, they thought that the women were safe because during World War I, the women, weren't imprisoned or whatever. They weren't harmed in the way that they were later on. So my parents wound up east in the Polish town of Rivne, which is in the Ukraine. And they lived there for about a year. And at that time, my father was able to get a job working as a doctor in that town in Ukraine. And then, the Germans came. But before the Germans came, my parents left Stry, and they left Rivne, and they went to Stry, another town in Ukraine, and said goodbye to my grandmother. And it was very touching in the movie, the goodbyes, the last time that people saw their parents. So they said goodbye to my grandmother, not knowing, of course, that that would be the last goodbye. And they went off to Stry. And in Stry, the Ukraine, my father was able to get a job as a doctor in a clinic there. But after the Germans invaded Stry, they started ghettoizing, which is pointed out in the film too, different places. So the place that my father was a doctor started to have a ghetto, and my grandfather and uncle were there too. They met up. And at that time, my father worked at the clinic, and the other doctors said, the Germans need us. They need the medical staff. We're protected and we're safe. In the meantime, in Stry, there were 8 of these so-called actions or actions where there were massacres of Jews in the forest. Thousands and thousands of Jews in the forest were killed while my parents were in the Ukraine and in the town of Stry. And so my father heard the other doctors saying, don't worry, we're safe, we're protected, the Germans need us. And my father was, no, I know the Germans. We can't stay here, we have to leave. But what are we going to do? So my father and his brother said, we're going to go to Warsaw, which was, very, very risky. But before they went, and this is where the underground comes in, so forgive me for being long-winded here. Before they went, there was somebody from the resistance movement who offered people false identification cards. And that's the picture you've got coming up. Okay, so this was my father's false identification card, blown up. I have the original. And my mother's, and also somewhere here. Yeah, my uncle. My uncle was 13 when the war broke out. He was much younger than my father, who was 30. His actual 30th birthday was September 2nd, the day they fled from Krakow. And so my father and my uncle got on a train, which of course was forbidden to Jews, and they went to Warsaw, and they left my mother behind. That trip to Warsaw, which was in 43, when the ghetto was, or I don't know if they actually went the first time when the ghetto was burning or not, but in 43 they went, and they had to stay in Lvov at a hotel, and there was some woman there who they got the sense that they would be betrayed, and they ran and they escaped and they went back on the train back to to Stree. The next time my mother went with them, and they made it to Warsaw, and here comes the resistance movement again. So they got to Warsaw. My father must have known the network of who to contact where and when through his medical clinic and also the false papers that he got. But when he got to Warsaw, somebody, probably one of these brave couriers who worked from place to place, met them and gave my parents and my uncle an address of where they could stay and helped my father get a job in an underground clinic as a doctor. And they were there in Warsaw from 43 until 44. So they were on the other side of the ghetto wall. And what the movie didn't present, and I know it couldn't present everything because it was an amazingly, broad movie, there were 10,000 Jews who were living on the Aryan or the other side of the wall. And so for about a year, my parents had to live, there. And I used to think that, they had it easy. They had papers until I started to read memoirs and so on and study what that meant. I mean, the amount of fear every time the door knocked, I'm going to stop, was amazing. So anyhow, they were in Warsaw and they survived. The end.
Jennifer, do we have time for one more question? Okay. All right, perfect. Then,
It's okay.
Paula, I'd love to hear a little bit about what making the film was like. So you've talked a little bit about how you came to the topic, but as Evie mentioned, it's a extremely broad subject, and especially for a film like this, that's so vital to as a counterweight to a really common misconception. I'm really love to hear, how do you dive into this subject?
Sure. Well, first of all, this all happened and unfolded during COVID. So we really couldn't visit anybody in person, which is kind of unlike the way that I like to make films. So I'm big on research. That's kind of my shtick. And so I started with scholars. And generally speaking, the scholars who were extremely generous with their time, I did about 150 interviews on Zoom, all of which are on my computer, which is probably why it's so incredibly slow now. And then the scholars led me to the survivors, and there are 5 survivors in the film, and to the survivors' children. So I was very lucky that everybody was extremely generous with their time and very kind about my total ignorance, because I really didn't know much about this topic, except, I did a lot of reading, of course, but, this is, you could spend years studying this and still not know all there is to know. And I do have to say one thing. This film is not original. It's not original research. I'm not a historian. I'm a journalist. And all of this is written about by scholars in their books. But for some reason, it has not made it to the general public. And lots of people still believe that Jews went to their deaths as sheep to the slaughter. It's amazing. I mean, often when I would say I'm making a film about Jewish resistance, the response would be, what resistance? So many times, I can't even count the number of times that happened. So I don't really understand. And plus, in the general media, it seems to be, it's very, people seem to think it's very nice to make films about Gentiles who rescued Jews. That seems to satisfy our ecumenical instincts that we all have. Schindler's List was, of course, a very great film, but in fact, that happened. Indeed, it did, but it was very rare. And most often, Jews rescued other Jews, and that's never really been recognized. It makes me furious. And even Yad Vashem, which has which recognizes righteous Gentiles, did not recognize righteous Jews who risked their own lives to rescue other Jews. B'nai B'rith does give an award, and David Gore and Bella Hazan have won that award. So I did research to try to summarize, and then in the summer of 2021, my co-director Kirk Wolfinger said, "Okay, we have to shoot," and I'm like, "Oh no!" And my kids were really furious that because Sheldon decided he was going to come with me because he had never been on any of my shoots before, and I supervised making about 650 films while I was running Nova, and he had never. So we wanted to see what it was like, and I was really glad he was coming because then he would see that it was actually pretty hard work, and not all just going to restaurants and drinking and having a good time. So anyway, we went to Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. Later in the fall, Israel, and around the United States. I have to say, nobody in the crew ever got COVID, which was great. So we went there and we did a lot of interviews, and we also did. I think one of the features you might notice in the film is the transition from images of these cities today to the historical images. And yes, and that was a very big part of our shoots because it's highly, highly technical to do it. Sometimes all we had was a curb stone to go on to make sure that we got the exact place to film, or just the side of a wall. And so, but I felt that it was something that was really important to show you this wasn't a fantasy of stuff that happened in the 40s. This was real, and it took place right in these places. And so we did the shooting, and I think the interviews were, they were just some of the, it was like some of the best interviews I've ever done, most amazing material that was revealed to me. And so then we get back, and we had written a treatment before we went. So I sort of had a plan for how I was going to get together. And this idea of dividing it into 3 books was something that was, I'm a big structure person. If you don't know the structure of the story, then you go out and shoot, and you're just shooting stuff, and you're just hoping to God that somehow it will go together. But I was very confident because we had a very tight structure. And I was I think the 2 things that were most revelatory to me is that Jews fought in the forest. I knew 30,000 Jews had fought in the forest, and that was very important, not only because they fought and killed Nazis and they saved people's lives, but also because it allowed Jews to use the forests to hide in. So, and to escape. And escape is a form of resistance. But the things that were really something that was really quite revelatory to me was this idea of Amidah, that even when Jews had no weapons in the ghettos, I mean, they were just, like people like us. I mean, what would we, just think, do you have guns in your house? I mean, we don't. And if we did, we wouldn't know what to do with them. And I mean, we're just not experienced in that way. And they're just like regular people, some Zionists, some religious, many very quite secular, and many very successful, came from very posh areas of Poland. And all of a sudden, they're herded into this horrible place, and they're sleeping, 8 families to a room. And, when you really think about it and put yourself in that place, it's horrible. And so this idea that they rebelled in ways that had been part of Jewish tradition always, which is in charity and acts of Gimilut Hasadim. And I found that very, very, that to me was extremely special. And then the other thing that was very special to me is we went to 3 different camps. And the idea that Jews who were starving in the camps, knowing that they would die, they knew, and all of the resistance fighters, none of them believed that they would survive. But they did it, as Michael Kovner said, for the honor of the Jewish people. And that really touched me and made me really wanted to tell this story. But the idea that Jews in death camps, near starvation themselves, worked to death, would rebel, and that of all the rebellions in the death camps, because remember, many of the prisoners in German camps were Poles and other people who were there for political reasons. And they didn't rebel, and they didn't help the Jews. And 3 million Russian POWs died in these camps, and they were the only other ones that rebelled. So the idea that Jews in death camps and that Jews led more rebellions than anybody else in death camps. So that was, and so I think that the thing that, I mean, putting together the film, I have to say, was really a joy. It was a labor of love, and it went together very well, almost because I was telling a story that I wasn't making up, that was there for me to just grasp. The hard thing, of course, was what to leave out. If you go on the website, we have a website, www.theyfoughtback.com. You'll see there are a lot of clips that we couldn't include in the film of other kinds of resistance, which I loved. And it broke my heart to leave them out, too. So that was the hard thing, what to leave out. So, and so the film was finished. I don't think I ever enjoyed, I mean, this is a very difficult topic, but putting it together was just something that really appealed to me and to my team. My team at Lone Wolf, none of them except one person was Jewish. They were all Christians, or nothing. And it really was very moving to me to see how dedicated they became to this film, and how this film really, these are journalists and filmmakers who've made hundreds of films, how this is the one that's so outstanding in their eyes, and none of them are Jewish, and I think it meant every bit as much to them as to me. Yes? Is there any chance this is my cousin. Well, you know, I think that I think not on film, but I think that that's something that can certainly be done on the website. It's actually a really good idea, and so, but we can certainly, you know, a website is like kind of like a garbage can that you can throw everything at it that you couldn't fit in the film. So I haven't had a lot of time to work on it. But in fact, my 11-year-old grandson, Daniel, is my webmeister because I can't do any of the technical stuff. So when I tell him now, and I have to tell him, Daniel, we have a lot of work to do. And he called me a couple of weeks ago because he wrote the thing where people can write in. And he said, you have 5,000 people have written in, Bubby. You really have to get moving to write to them. And I'm like, oh, my God, more pressure from an 11-year-old.
Paula and Evie, thank you both so much. I'd like to invite Jennifer up to announce our raffle winner.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ori. Thank you so much, Paula. Thank you so much, Evie. I want to thank the Tucson Jewish History Museum and Holocaust Center,